So I finally got my hands on an HD8XX from Drop. Some quick disclosures here. Drop did send this out for review. They're not paying, asking, or otherwise influencing me to say anything good or bad. Now, in this particular case, what I was asked to do was consult, sort of loosely, on some pre-production models that they had. If you recall, actually, if you've been following the channel for a bit, I actually did a review of a pre-production model that Drop sent to me. Now here's a tiny bit of drama that's a little bit frustrating on my end, but I won't burden you too much with the information. So in that review, I was told that that was going to be the final sound version of that headphone. Though it came in an 800S chassis, it did not come in the 8XX chassis, so I couldn't film it because it wasn't representative of the actual product. But again, I was told that it was going to be the final version of the sound. It was not. Now, unfortunately, I trusted Drop a little bit too much when they told me that, and I told you that it was going to be the final version of the sound. That is obviously incorrect, and that video has since been taken down because it's incorrect information. Now, that being said, I'm going to have to be a lot more cautious moving forward with what Drop tells me in terms of what's the final version of what until the product is actually released. So hopefully I won't make that mistake again. That was my bad. So it has changed quite a bit. They've sent a number of iterations out to me and a bunch of other reviewers and a bunch of other people in the audio community, and they settled on this version. Now, there are two ways to talk about this headphone and do this review, and I'm gonna kind of combine these just for the sake of efficiency and save you a little bit of time. One way is to talk about this headphone and basically not mention the 800S. Just talk about this headphone as it exists at this price tag and how it competes with other headphones, and just keep it simple like that. The other way is to compare it to the HD800S because that's what it's modeled off of. I'm gonna kind of land somewhere in the middle here, okay? Okay, so let's start off strong with the reason to purchase an HD8XX or an HD800S, and that is simply put, sound staging. Now, the sound staging on this headphone, while it's not quite as open and boundaryless as the 800S, is very close. It's close enough to where at this price point, nothing really competes with this headphone for sound staging. Now, a little bit of sound staging 101. If you're unfamiliar with the term sound staging and what imaging might be, let me kind of explain. So sound staging is going to be the field and the width around and on top and below your head that sounds feel like they can come from. Now, bad sound staging headphones feel very close. They feel very compressed. Nothing seems like it's coming from outside the headphones or your head. Good sound staging headphones, like this one, kind of open that boundary a little bit. It feels very open, and the environment around you seems to be very endless. That's exactly what this headphone sort of sounds like when you're listening to it. Now, imaging is going to be the precision of the instruments, of the sounds within that given soundstage. So the HD800S and the 8XX have a very wide soundstage. It's very open, but it's also very precise in terms of the imaging placement. That's the real benefit of these headphones. It always has been, and it still continues to be today. So soundstage has been weakened a little bit, but I don't think it's quite enough to really complain at the price tag. It still leaves the 800S being a little bit better of a headphone and costing a little bit more. So let's talk about something that's a little bit more controversial, which is the bass. Okay, so they've done a pretty big bump in bass response over the HD800S. So they've made this to be not what I would consider a bassy headphone, but it is bassier than it was in the past. Now, if you ever EQ'd the 800S, you'll know that the bass didn't really hold up in terms of a lot of its harmonic properties. It didn't really slam like a lot of planars that their price range can slam. When you compare this bass response to something like an LCD-X, it's very clear that it's not really a super bass capable headphone, if that makes any sense. Like, you can EQ a ton of bass into this, and at a certain point, you just won't get anything more out of it. It'll just kind of hit a brick wall for sound and harmonic properties, and then just kind of stop. So while this is a little bit more boosted and a little bit more tuned towards you bass heads, it's really not going to satisfy the people who really desire a lot of bass. This is still a very clean sound signature. Now, one of the more controversial areas of the bass response is how it handles those harmonics. Now, the bass here is a tiny bit fuzzy, to be honest. It's not quite as clear and refined as the 800S. Now, to be honest, I think that this might be a limitation of the sound. I've tried many mods of people who claim to get substantial bass and great bass out of the HD800S with modifications. I've never really heard anything that was really satisfactory to me compared to what I know is out there for either this price or even cheaper. And it's kind of the same thing with this. Like, it's good bass. It's not phenomenal. It's not the point or the reason to buy this headphone. But if you were desiring a little bit more bass than something like a standard 800 or an 800S, I think this will satisfy that craving. Okay, so mid-range. This is another controversial part of this headphone. Okay, lower mid-range has, I think, been improved. It's a little bit more full, it's a little bit more fulfilled, and it just feels more present and not so absent like it did on the 800S. So you get kind of fuller, more immediate, kind of more in-your-face vocals, especially on the low end. That, to me, is a big improvement over the 800S. The 800S always felt like a little devoid of power in the vocals, and this adds a little bit of oomph and guts and texture down low. But they've also dipped down the upper mids past the point of where the 800S was. So in the lower mids, it seems very forward and very present, but in the upper mids, it feels a little bit dull, a little bit missing, a little bit dry in that area, and a little bit reduced even further than the 800S was. And then of course you got the peak after that in the upper mids in the S and the T range. Now that actually has been suppressed even further than it was on the 800S, which I think is a good move. And that makes this headphone a lot less fatiguing than the previous generations were, which I am very grateful for. Now, depending on who you are and the structure of your ear, things like the 800 or the 800S can be really, really fatiguing to listen to. For me, they were really fatiguing to listen to. This does a lot to kind of neuter that, but it does have some downsides, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the treble. So treble response. Oddly enough, they measure fairly closely on a frequency response graph, but the sonic signature of them when you're actually listening to them, this actually seems a lot less forward in the treble response than the 800S does. Now this leads this overall headphone sounding a bit less clear actually. It doesn't sound quite as sparkly or as transient and as vivid in the top end as the previous generations have been. Now this can easily be corrected in EQ, but out of the box, if you're just listening to the straight headphone, this headphone does sound a little bit muted in comparison to some of those other headphones. Now it's still more forward than something like the aforementioned LCDX. It's also a little bit more clinical, I would say, than something like a Focal Clear MG. This feels a lot more detailed than that headphone does, but doesn't quite have the mid-range quality and fulfillment in all ranges as the Clear MG does. If you really like vocals, I'd probably stick with an MG in this range. But the main point is that despite what frequency response graphs may suggest these being somewhat unequal playing fields in terms of treble forwardness, I actually find that the treble is not really as forward on this. This could be for a couple reasons. If you see here, they've actually modified the inside, and I'll do a close-up shot here. They've modified the inside to be a little less resonant, especially around the 6 to 8K region of the standard 800S. Now, a lot of that resonance, that ringing, was actually causing most of the fatigue issues for users like myself. So now the top end measures about the same frequency rise, but has a lot less ringing and a lot less resonance than the previous generation did, which makes it sound a little bit muted in comparison to that, but also cleaner, and it feels like the treble is up and kind of done with faster, doesn't hang around quite as long as 800S does. Now, on a personal note here, I feel like they should have kind of done a halfway in between here. This doesn't feel as brilliant in the top end as the 800S does, and it feels a little bit under what I would actually prefer to do. So for the first time, I think ever, I'm actually EQing a little bit of treble into this to make it sound a little bit sparklier in the top end than it is just straight out of the box, which is a ridiculous thing to say, but that's where I'm at. Okay, so I mentioned EQ, let's talk about that a little bit. I'm not a person who really EQs really anything. I like things to sound unique and distinct and use them for unique and distinct reasons. I'm in a very fortunate position to have a lot of headphones around me, and I don't really like them to all sound the same or meet some sort of target. That's just not how I choose to listen. If that's how you choose to listen, like no shade or anything, it's just not how I choose to listen. But I will say this, if you are willing to EQ this headphone, the results can be fantastic. And actually a quick little trick here is if you want this to sound more like an HD800S, you can actually look at some of the frequency response differences and actually EQ them. And you can actually get this headphone to sound pretty close to that headphone for a lot less money. And that's with a free equalizer software like Equalizer APO, which is, if you're into EQing, going to be kind of your bread and butter program. And while I don't typically choose myself to EQ, I will not deny its use case and its benefits to the right user and for the right headphones. So if this isn't what you want quite out of the box, you might want to look at EQing. And this is a sentiment that's not only echoed by me, but a lot of the Drop reviews on Drop's website from users are also saying the same thing. And I totally agree. Gaming performance. HD800S, best gaming headphone. HD800S, still the best gaming headphone. This because of its slight soundstage reduction, because I think they've closed off some of the holes in the back of the driver here. Maybe I'll get a close-up shot of that. It sounds a little less open. It does. But it's still, at this price, the best gaming headphone. So right now, the hierarchy of gaming headphones at any price range for me is probably something along the lines of HD800S, AB1266, which is way outside of this price range, 8XX, then PC38X. So those are kind of your top 4 gaming headphones at any price range in terms of capability. This is legal wall hacks for every single game. It's ridiculous how well these perform in game. If you're looking for the best gaming headphone and you've got the money to spend on this or the HD800S, I would highly, highly suggest it. Okay, so conclusion. There's a couple thoughts I have here. One, it depends on whether or not you're willing to EQ or not. If you're willing to EQ, this headphone is actually a pretty good deal. If you're not willing to EQ, this headphone is full of benefits, but it's also full of detriments. It's kind of this weird in between. I recommend it for some users, but not for others. Now, I feel like what Drop should have done is simply corrected the errors of the 800S. I think if they just did that, they didn't have to do anything else. They just had to get an 800S out there with less flaws. And that thing would have sold like crazy. I'd be sitting here recommending it. Basically, every reviewer I know would be sitting here recommending it. But instead, it seems like what they chose to do, instead of just correcting errors, is they tried to make this basically a different headphone. And I think this was a bit of a misguided thing for them to do because while it doesn't have the same issues as the 800S, it also kind of inadvertently created new issues for it to deal with. So similar to the 800S, I'm sitting here saying that yes, it's got some major upsides for the money, but it also has some major downsides for the money. And it kind of goes back and forth, and now it just has different upsides and different downsides than the previous generation 800S did. So if you're deciding between the 800S and this, if you like brilliance in the high end and probably the best soundstaging headphone on the market, I think the 800S is the way to go. If you like a little bit more filled out vocals, a little bit more bass response, and care about soundstaging but don't really value that as the top priority for a headphone, then the 8XX is probably going to be the one to go. Again, highly recommended the use of EQ with this headphone. That makes this actually a decent value. Now, if you're looking in this price range, but not quite to the price range of the 800S, what are your options and what would you get with other headphones? Well, around this price range, you have something like an LCD-X that has better bass response, probably a little bit better mid-range, but a lot more closed-in sound, not quite as wide in the sound signature. Though even though it's not as bright as the 8XX is, it actually seems like it has less of a veil than the 8XX does for some odd reason. Again, EQ fixes this issue, but that might be a headphone to consider. You also have the Focal Clear, which is a very, very good mid-range headphone. It's also got some pretty decent bass response and is pretty well-rounded for things like treble response and soundstaging, but it doesn't quite have the soundstaging prowess that this headphone has. And I think that's why a lot of people will be buying this, is that soundstaging capability. So like most high-end headphones, it really depends on what your priorities are and what you prefer to get from your headphones, to extract from your headphones. This is not a perfect headphone in every category, but in some categories, it is the best in the price range. Okay guys, thanks a lot for watching. Till the next video, my name is Josh, signing off.